Welcome to the Strategy Skills podcast. Today, Michael and I will do part 3 of 42 million in fees from one single engagement series. Before we dive in, we have two gifts for you. One is the overall approach used in well-managed strategy studies. It is a free download you can get on firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. It is firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. And if you're currently looking for another opportunity, the second gift we have for you is McKinsey and BCG winning resume. It is also a free download. You can get it on firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF. So let's talk about making 42 million in fees from one engagement. In part 1, we covered the person. In part 2, we covered the assets. So if you missed those two episodes, go and listen to them first. And today we will cover the problem. Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Kris. Good to be here.
So let's start with the question, why did we feel the need to change the problem?
Well, it's a good question to start with. I think the most important thing to remember is that we don't intend to change the problem statement when we arrive. We don't intend to change the problem statement. What we do want to make sure is that the problem that is being presented to us is actually the right problem that needs to be solved. And in this particular case, we were trying to understand why Andrew and his firm had selected the definition of innovation that they had selected. Because if you think about it, the definition you choose is a mental trap. Because anything that you include in the definition is things you would consider to be part of innovation and you'd pursue it as an opportunity. And anything you exclude from the definition becomes things you wouldn't look at. And this becomes very important for us to understand how they've defined innovation and whether or not that definition is the best definition to use given Andrew's firm's capabilities. Could they solve the innovation problem they're defined with their capabilities? And second, is it the best definition to use for clients? And the issue here isn't that a definition can be right or wrong. Sometimes it can be right or wrong. But is it the appropriate definition to use? So we started with asking very fundamental questions like, why have we defined innovation in this way? Is it the right definition? Is it the best definition? Why haven't we defined it in this way? Do we understand with this definition, we're excluding certain things that would normally be done? So it's really about going back to fundamentals. And when we went through that process, which lasted a few weeks, we then realized the definition of innovation they're using is not appropriate.
Michael, and you mentioned things that are normally done. What is the problem most people address when doing innovation projects?
That's another good question. So let's go back to the basics. Always go back to the basics. Why do people innovate in the first place? Now, in some cases, it's a matter of survival, but in a capitalist world, it's more to grow. So what happens is that companies want to become more valuable. They want to have a higher market cap because they think that's a good thing, right? And it usually is. But what happens with this definition is that everyone looks at innovation as a way to generate more revenue, as a way to generate more profits, as a way to generate more free cash flow, which they hope will show up in their valuation. So a lot of innovation is about growth, bigger, better products, more products, and so on. But if you really think about it, that's one way to increase your valuation. Another way is to reduce your cost base. So you can reduce your cost base, you can even become smaller as a company and increase your valuation. Ferrari is a great example of that. They don't increase their valuation by producing more cars. They increase their valuation by increasing the value of their cars and the cachet of their brand. So people focus a lot on growth, a little bit on costs, but if you think about it at its most basic level, the valuation of a company is determined by the risk to future cash flow. But you almost never hear anyone talk about how innovation can contribute to managing the risk of a business. So we started looking at things at the most basic definitions, real basic stuff. And we started saying, hold on a second, there's big parts of the innovation topic that companies are not focusing on. You can understand why most practitioners and business executives don't look at the risk side, because risk is something that's really hard to understand, analyze. So it's given mostly lip service. But really, most companies, when they talk about innovation, it's about growth on the profit line.
Let's next elaborate. Why is that not the problem we decided to address?
There was a famous physicist, Enrico Fermi, and he used to have cheeseburgers for lunch. And during an interview, they asked him, how do you win a Nobel Prize? And he said, the way to win a Nobel Prize is to go where nobody else is looking and do research where nobody else is doing research. Now, we could have gone in any direction on innovation, but there's a couple of things we want to get right here. Andrew's firm has resources that other firms don't have. The problem we tackle in innovation needs to be drawing and using the resources Andrew's firm has. There's a number of reasons for doing that. That means that if we solve the innovation problem in a way that we use most of the resources of Andrew's firm, another rival firm that is not structured as Andrew's firm, that doesn't have the same resources, would struggle to respond to us. So that's the first reason. The second one is that when we started looking at clients, we started looking, where could we have the biggest impact? A lot has already been written in the field of how to innovate for new products and so on, and everyone's focused on that. We wanted to go to a place where it would give Andrew's firm an edge, it would create great value for clients, and it would be a space that other rivals couldn't easily copy and attack Andrew's firm. So when we were doing this, we were not just thinking about how do you sell the most kind of innovation projects. We're being very strategic in taking steps to act where competitors couldn't act, and which would have the biggest impact on the client. And when we triangulated those three things, we realized that it made very little sense to look at growing revenue and profits. Not that it's not important, but as a long-term bet to build a viable business in a way that it'll be hard to compete against, looking at the other sides made a lot more sense for us.
And it's generally something we recommend our clients to do, to always look at how they can do something differently, because doing everything the same way as everyone else, it makes it very hard to achieve outsized results. So how did we arrive at the right problem? Did we do some kind of analysis? How did we figure out the problem to address?
It's a summary of the first three responses. Basically, there's no analysis that's going to do this. It's basically asking very fundamental questions and assuming nothing. So some discussions would have, and Andrew and his team would say, well, it's obvious we should do it this way. But then I would say, and you were there as well, Kris, why is it obvious that we would do it this way? Why is there not another way to do it? So if everyone is doing something, we call it best practice. But I have a different word for it. I call it collective delusion. If everyone is doing the same thing, it could be best practice, or it could be everyone is wrong, or it could be they're not wrong, but they're not generating the best result. So it was everything we did. It was going back to fundamentals, saying, we're doing this. Why are we doing this? What is the value of doing this? And the other very important question we ask is not just why we're doing it, but why are we doing it now? Why should we not wait 2 years to do this or 3 years? So basic things we unpacked over a series of weeks, and we started playing around. What would it mean if we answered this question without any preconditions and preconceptions of what we think the correct answer is? So it's just this what if process that we go through. We keep asking, what if we did this? What if we did this? What if it was this? What if it was not this? It seems tedious. For a lot of people, it seems like a waste of time. And this is one of the reasons I always tell people, when you come into meetings with us, don't call yourself an expert. If you call yourself an expert, there's a lot of pressure on you to be right, which means you never open yourself up to hearing another side. So when you go into meetings, never act like an expert, never pretend you're going to be an expert, always be open-minded. And that's how we keep the discussion at the point whereby we can really tackle things at a fundamental level.
This is so true. And this is something I have seen so often happening with people who are incredibly talented and have phenomenal careers, achieve such great results early on in their career, but then as their career progresses, at some point they decide they became an expert and they start looking down on people, they close their own mind towards new knowledge that they can acquire. And when you communicate to them in a meeting, they actually don't even listen to you when you speak. They're just waiting to speak. And they even try to take all the space throughout the meeting. And what happens with people like that is they start deteriorating, because if you're not learning, you're going the other way. You're either climbing upwards or you're going down. You're not standing still, because the world is not standing still. Everyone are growing. And so It's so incredibly important. Not only just say to people you are not an expert, because that will change how they will communicate with you, but also how it changes. If you say to yourself, I am an expert, it actually creates all kinds of dangers for you that can result in your downfall. So once we came up with a new problem, why did we feel this is worth addressing? How did we knew we could build a business of this? Specifically because earlier we were talking about not focusing on consulting revenue, but building something different. How did we see that?
It's a very, very good question. How did we know this would work when we're doing something that nobody else is doing? And obviously, there are very smart people in other companies, in other firms, and so on. So we can't say that we were smarter than them in any manner at all. We just were seeing something they weren't seeing. The way we knew that we could build a business of this, I'm going to explain the answer. It's a bit of an unusual answer. But I look back at the worst decisions I've made in my life. Whenever I made the worst decisions in my life, and what I've noticed is that when I'm working with someone that made a bad decision, it often is because when a decision is being made, I am trusting that the other person has fully thought it through. So when they say, look, it's going to work, I know it's going to work, I sometimes give them the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, this person is smart. If they say it's going to work, let's trust them and go ahead with it. But I've learned a very important lesson in life. Unless it works in my mind, unless the business model works in my mind, unless I can actually see how all the pieces come together, I'm not going to go ahead with this. So how do we test this? How do we know it can work? I start arranging the business model in my head and start playing with it and saying, okay, what if we move this piece? What if we move this piece? That's the business model. Then I think about the operating model. So the business model is how we're going to make money, how we're going to collect $1 of revenue from a client, how it's going to flow through the system to get into our bank account. The operating model is what assets do we need to have to make this happen? Assets in terms of people and capital, physical assets, because this is not a consulting study. Here we're going to do something very different. So I want to see how do all the pieces come together. And the most important thing is to actually have the confidence to admit if the model doesn't work in your head and go back to the drawing board and say, okay, this doesn't seem right, let's fix it. Because what happens with a lot of people is they look around a room, and if enough people are excited about something, they'll say, well, if enough people are excited about it, let me do it. Or they'll look out to someone they trust, someone they think is an expert, and they'll say, if this person thinks it'll work and they're an expert, then I'll go ahead with it. So you've got to have a lot of confidence to stop something and fix it if it doesn't make sense to you. If it does not make sense to me, I won't proceed with something, even if 12 people in the room are saying, why are you holding up the room? Because I'm not saying I'm smarter than them, but I am trained in a certain way to think about these things. The same way that I would expect someone who, for example, walks dogs would know how to walk a dog better than me, or is a chef would be a better chef than me. They're trained to do that. So I'm trained to do this, but it's not about analysis. It's about confidence. It's about being able to say, we need to pause and we need to fix something before more trouble occurs, or we made a mistake, because we're always going to make mistakes. People need to know about that. And it's about taking complete accountability and responsibility for making sure this makes sense before we proceed. Once that model starts clicking in my head, then I realize, okay, we have something here and we can move forward on this.
And this is such a crucial characteristic to have as a leader, to be willing to say, no, hold on, this is not working, instead of doing what is comfortable. Because sometimes the easiest thing is to just go with the flow. You already have a lot of momentum, everyone is excited, or have a buy-in, everything is underway, a lot of things are done, and to say, hold on, this is not going to work, we need to start again from scratch. Or even if you're not starting from scratch, but you have to do a lot of additional work to change the direction, that is not something that everyone is willing to do, but it's so important to do as a leader what you feel is right, even if it's not the simplest, the easiest path forward.
Well said. Including in this particular piece of work, there was a time where Andrew and his team were selling innovation strategy projects. And at one stage that brought in about $2 million worth of revenue, but then we stepped in and said, hold on a second. When we first decided to become involved, we very clearly said we want to do something different, not just sell more advisory work, because in the long term, Andrew's firm can never be the dominant player in the advisory space. They may win one or two little battles against the bigger strategy firms, but the long-term play, given the assets of Andrew's firm, they are better placed to do other kinds of work. So that's an example, again, where we had to stop them, as you said, Kris, from doing what they were comfortable doing, which is selling what they were always selling, even though there was never the intention of doing this intervention or interaction with them.
And when a company has assets that other companies don't have, it makes it so much harder for competitors to copy, and in some cases impossible. So it's about creating that system that is very hard to copy.
You want to have interlocking assets that cannot be replicated, or it can only be replicated at a great amount of cost and time.
Exactly. So we got to take a brief sponsor break. When we come back, we will ask Michael, how did we know it would work? A very, very important question. So over 13 years ago, we turned the world of business strategy and problem-solving education on its head by building out the largest and most powerful business strategy and problem-solving video and audio training library in the world, strategytraining.com and strategy training apps. And for those of our listeners who are not quite sure what we are doing, they're listening to our podcast, but they are not familiar with what we are doing, this is a great part of the podcast for you. We are the only place in the world where you can truly learn strategy and problem-solving skills without ever having to work for a major consulting firm. And our members include partners from major consulting firms, very elite consulting firms, the largest international consulting firms, all the way to the board level. But you might also be surprised to know that most of our members are not in consulting, and they're not interested in going into consulting, but they understand how powerful the skills that we teach are. And in fact, the skills we teach are even more powerful outside of consulting because they are so rare outside of consulting. 2 membership levels on strategytraining.com that give access to some of our advanced video and audio programs are insider and legacy memberships. If you are an insider or legacy member, you can work through step-by-step consulting engagements. You will not find it anywhere else in the world. And you can see in detail how to complete a strategy engagement or a consulting engagement. And in fact, by working through those step-by-step studies, you can learn more than consultants learn during a typical engagement, because there no one will teach you every step. And we have many other programs teaching some of the most powerful skills you will not learn anywhere else, the skills that can significantly increase your level of influence in any room. And that is something you need as a leader, because if people are not listening to you, it's very hard to get things done. Many of our insiders and legacy members also enjoy reading. So in response to numerous requests over many years, this summer we launched something called the Strategy Control Room, which is the largest business strategy and problem-solving reading library in the world. It consists of full studies, million-dollar proposals, exclusive transcripts, and many other very powerful strategy and problem-solving documents. And we are making regular updates to the Strategy Control Room advanced level. So it's almost impossible to even go through all the materials in there. Also, some of you are reaching out to ask us how you can buy our books since they are no longer on Amazon. I'm getting a lot of messages like that now. We still have few of our books on Amazon, but we actually pulled almost all our books from Amazon, including our best-selling books that were used and are used in major universities around the world as prescribed reading, like Succeeding as a Management Consultant, the Strategy Journal. Those books are also used by very senior executives at major organizations around the world, and those books are now exclusively available within the Strategy Control Room advanced level, and we released there many new strategy books and manuals which were never available on Amazon or anywhere else. So anyway, check it out at strategytraining.com. So in summary, legacy or insider membership gives you access to some of our advanced video and audio training programs. Legacy members also get additional advanced training, plus 2 times a month, Michael and I do a live group legacy coaching call where each legacy member can get input for their most pressing question. And we actually answer every question. That is very rare for programs like that. They can either submit the question or they can be live on the call and submit it on the call in the beginning of the call. So legacy members can get live input from me and Michael 2 times a month for the particular unique situation. And even if you cannot attend, you can submit your question and then catch a replay. And the strategy control room advanced level gives access to our full strategy reading library, including transcripts from some of our training programs, full studies. We actually have more full studies in the control room than we have on strategytraining.com because, of course, it takes a lot of time to actually put it into a program. We have proposals there, other strategy documents, and it also includes all our strategy manuals and books. My view is that either of those memberships is the best business strategy and critical thinking education gift you can ever give someone or give yourself. They have different content within them and they are both very powerful. And if you have questions, you can email team@firmsconsulting.com. Now, let's get back to the main event. We got Michael with us today, and we are doing part 3 of the 42 million in fees for one engagement series. In part 1, we covered the person and gave you context from phase 1 of this program. In part 2, we focused on assets, and in part 3, we are focusing on the problem. Michael, so how did we know it would work?
Another good question, Kris. I'm going to give an example that I think will relate to many people, and then I'll pull the example, the concept from the example back into the work itself. If I ask someone to design an iPhone from scratch, who doesn't have any engineering skills and knows nothing about electronics, it's a scary, impossible, daunting task. But if you took an iPhone and you stripped it apart and you laid each individual component in a line or in a thread where you can see how it connects to every other part, if you broke down every single component and then you start analyzing each component, it becomes a lot easier to understand how to put together and how to manufacture an iPhone, which is, by the way, how the competitors of the iPhone actually operate. When the iPhone is released, they buy the iPhone, they strip it down. They go through every single component. They test every single component to see whether it works the way it was intended to work. And then they take a component and they strip it down even further to see who the suppliers were. Now, when you do that to any complicated product, it's not as daunting as it sounds. And we know it's not as daunting as it sounds because Apple's competitors have been using that approach to, in some cases, catch up with them, in some cases, even leapfrog them in some capabilities, right? We've seen Samsung do that. So this is the approach we used when we were testing to see how it will work. The challenge we faced is, this is something the firm has never done before. How do we know it's going to work? Okay, this is what we know. We know that making up this overall initiative, we're running, there's many sub-functions, there are sub-activities. So we went through each sub-activity and we asked ourselves, can that sub-activity work the way it's intended to work? So for example, right, Andrew's firm has a fleet, a legion of lawyers that have a whole team there who do legal work for clients and so on. So what we decided to do is we said, okay, when we put these lawyers into this new initiative, can they do the legal work they're supposed to do? And what we realized is that the work they would have done in the old model would be exactly the same kind of work that they would do in the new model. The difference is we have rearranged how they would work with the other parts of the business. And more importantly, we've rearranged the business model for how they'd be remunerated. But the work is the same. It's just that we've mixed things up in a different order to create something new. So that's actually the actual approach I used to show Andrew how he would convince his leadership team. First, don't show them how we're going to initially assemble all the assets of the business. First, show them that each of the assets that we're going to use is going to be doing the same work as before. Once they understand that, then to show them how we're going to shuffle them in a different order, but they're still going to be doing the same work. Once that kind of exercise was done, it became very easy for us to get buy-in and get this sold through. Because we were showing them the firm is going to be doing the same work it's always done. We're just going to do it in a different way. We're going to arrange the pieces in a different way. It's not that the lawyers, for example, are going to be doing law in a different way. It's not that the auditors are going to be doing audit in a different way. No, they're going to be doing the same things, but the way it's going to be used, the outputs are going to be used very differently. So it's going to have very little impact in the firm's ability to ramp up, because we're not asking them to do things in a new way. Same way, but used in a different way. And that is how we managed to get them to understand how it will work. It's exactly like the iPhone model. You take apart each piece and see if it will work as it's intended to work. And then when you add them together, you would ask yourself, why wouldn't they work together? What's different? And if you can see there's nothing different, then it's not hard to get a buy-in on this. Well, it's hard to develop the thinking to explain it. The easy part is once we've done that, then it's easy. But, it's a difficult thing. You've got to think very carefully about how to explain this to everyone involved.
And to many people, what we did would sound very risky, because if you are doing something other people are not doing, there must be a reason they are not doing it.
Yes, and in this case, we had to even ring fence this initiative in a separate legal entity, because there are many reasons why we had to do that. And it made a lot of sense to do that, to protect the firm, to protect the client, and so on. Let me put it this way. At the end of the day, the analogy I used with them is that they kept on saying that, well, what if this thing blows up? What if this thing blows up? And I pointed out to them, it's only a problem if it blows up and it's close to us. If this blows up and we've found a way to ring fence it so it cannot affect us, then it's a risk worth taking. And that's the thing you got to understand. It's not if something will blow up, it's what will be the fallout on you if it blows up. Of course, we don't want it to blow up, and it didn't blow up. But you've got to think in that creative way to say, okay, what if it blows up? What precautions do we have in place, assuming that happens? Because if you tell people, take the risk, it's never going to happen, I think it's unfair to ask them to do that.
Very true. Michael, is there a question that you would want me to ask and I haven't asked you?
Well, you can ask the question that Andrew's senior partner asked him, which is, Andrew, you speak a lot about this innovation stuff, but it looks a lot like cost reduction work. So most firms do cost reduction work. How is this innovation, or is it cost reduction dressed up as innovation to make it easier to sell? So let's work with that one. Kris, how does that sound?
Sounds amazing.
So I'm going to use the same example I used with Andrew, which I know he used when he was taking this through the reviews. So I gave him a case to show him how it will play out. I told him, okay, Andrew, you have been hired by the National Taxi Association of the city of, let's say, New York. It's 2005. And you are working for the National Taxi Association. So the New York City Cab Association, whatever it's called, they have a fleet of cabs. They probably got repair rooms. They've got a dispatch office. They've got a whole infrastructure that supports these cabs. They've brought you in, and they want you to develop a strategy for them. Now, what would you do for them? And my only piece of advice to him was that don't say you'll turn them into Uber. Assume you've never heard of Uber, right? And even so, right? The kind of work and thinking he put in here was along the lines of how they can change their pricing, they can increase customer service, they can reduce their maintenance costs, and so on. He came up with all the typical stuff of how to make this a better cab business. Now, the important thing here is that even when I told him that now what would you do if I say you could make them Uber, he still decided that he'd make them a better cab service, because his logic was that, well, if Uber exists everywhere, we need to be different. Why don't we be different by not being Uber? Now, but here's the flaw in the thinking, right? What is the difference between Uber and the Taxi Cab Association of New York, or whatever it's called? The difference is that in the Taxi Cab Association, all of the assets, the cars, the warehouses, the maintenance facilities, and so on the books of the Taxi Cab Association. I'm assuming in this example, they own the cabs. I'm not sure if they do, but assuming they own the cabs, they would put all those assets as assets on their balance sheet. Because for their business model, those are assets. For Uber's business model, for Uber to own a fleet of cars, that would be a liability for them. So what we've been seeing here is that an asset is only an asset relative to the business model you choose. There's no such thing as this is always going to be an asset. Now, in a manner of speaking, you can say the difference between Uber and a national or citywide taxi cab association, one that owns its fleet of taxis, is that the only difference between Uber and that association is that Uber removed all of the costs. You could, in a certain universe, argue that's cost reduction work, but I mean, to anyone, you can see it's a completely different shift in the paradigm of thinking of how to create value in a certain sector. So when we talk a lot about how we looked at the costs and the asset classes and so on, it sounds like cost reduction work, but it's not cost reduction work. It's removing redundant assets as opposed to lowering the cost. We actually removed entire asset classes from the balance sheet because by changing the business model of the clients a little bit, we're able to take assets and turn them into liabilities. And I'm not using the accounting definition. I'm basically saying that things that add value no longer add value and you no longer need them. So using the Uber example and the taxi cab example, you can see that there's a huge difference between what Uber does and what the taxi cabs do. A lot of it has to do with the asset structure and the cost structure of the two businesses. One's cost structure is much smaller and the other one is much larger. One's asset structure is much larger, capital assets, the other is much smaller. You would need to do a evisceration of all of those assets to get to Uber. And you can argue it's cost reduction, but it's really changing the business model. Did I explain that well, Kris?
Very well. So this is a great place to wrap up this amazing episode of the 3-part series. Before we do so, Michael, anything else you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I think that when we launch these programs, we have to describe what they're about. So we have to tell you it's a program about innovation. But if you go through this program, this is about a fundamental rethinking of how a business creates value, both for Andrew's firm, because we find a different way for them to create value, but also for the client, we find a different way for them to create value. So when you're thinking about this, and if you say, I'm not really interested in innovation, that's fine. But you're going to find this is about classic strategy and thinking. It's about going back and testing assumptions that have taken hold and have stuck with the business for years. It's about being able to look at data that everyone's looking at and being able to see an opportunity nobody else is seeing. So the best way to describe this is it's a journey we went on to help two companies, Andrew's company and Andrew's client, become something better than they were before in a sustainable way that their competitors would find very hard to replicate. And for me, that's really the beauty of these programs, because we work with one person over a very long time. You see them grow, you see them really struggle at times, because some of the things we want to do, they're hard to do. You know, it assumes Andrew has certain skills to pull this off. It assumes he's going to have the skill to go up to a very senior partner and explain a very difficult concept, to take the firm into a new area, which is by definition risky. And he has to bring together all of those skills that Kris talks about, gravitas and speaking with authority and so on, and deliver these things. And one of the things that is sometimes missed in the program is how difficult these things are to do. They're not easy. They take a lot of thinking and planning. You know, if you have a meeting with a senior partner and you mess up that meeting, you may never get a meeting again where he or she is going to be open to your ideas. So, and a lot of the things we do, we've got to distinguish between where we're going to move fast and break things and fix it later, and where we cannot move fast. We're going to go slowly, methodically, and really understand the action we're going to take before we take it. And the hardest part in the program is separating those two things and knowing which ones we can go fast on and which ones we need to go really slow on. And the biggest danger is to fall into a mindset when we meet obstacles, and we meet many obstacles where we assume that this can't be done. And we always have to come back and say, okay, we failed at this. We knew we were going to fail at certain things. How do we step back? How do we regroup? And how do we move forward? And the most important lesson in all of this is that anything worth pursuing is really hard. There's always going to be people standing in your way. And they're standing in your way not because they don't understand you. Often they know what you're trying to do. This goes ahead. They're going to lose access to clients. They're going to lose credibility because if you stand up and you show you've built something that they said was not possible, again, they lose standing. So anything you do in life that's worth doing, you would just expect a lot of resistance. And if you expect it and plan for it and laugh it off and look for opportunities to move things forward, then good things will happen. And I want people to take that from the program rather than simply looking at the mechanics of how we innovated.
I think that one of the reasons why our programs are so powerful is because we have a non-standard view of the world, and we have not a standard way of thinking about problems and thinking about opportunities. It is a powerful experience to be able to go through the journey and see how it is applied and what you can borrow and apply to your own life so that you can start getting results that are far above what is average in your particular organization.
Yes, that's very well said. I remember working with another client in the field of AI, and he asked me the question once, how come you're so excited about this? Even I'm not excited about it as much as you. Then I explained to him, think about it this way, right? We are at the early stages of AI. It's going to have a tremendous impact on the world. We are getting an opportunity to work within one of the most important tech companies in the world to leave a mark on the direction that AI will have and will take in the world. What could be more exciting than that? We get a chance to do something most people only dream about. So whenever I go into these situations, and sometimes Andrew and other clients will write to me and say they had a bad day, I always remind them, what's at stake here? You had a bad meeting. Are you going to let one misinformed, maybe malicious executive stop you from playing a critical role in one of the most important industries in the world? No, I don't think one person should stop you from doing that. It's about knowing what's at stake, which is why I always tell people, if you want to do big things in the world, don't go after small missions and tasks, because the magnitude or the gravity of what you're doing is so small, it's never going to spur you to go past the obstacles. So always pursue big things, meaningful things, because when you have bad days, you always remember why you're trying to do this and why it's worth convincing some executive who may be very difficult, but whose help you need, and it'll give you the incentive to do it. Go after big things.
Yes, because small things actually also take a lot of energy. You might as well go after big things. And then later on in life, looking back at your life, at least you will not think that you didn't try your best to make a positive impact and leave this world a better place and make it better for your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on.
Well said, Kris. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, so much for this episode and for all the wisdom that you are sharing. I know that you could be doing so many things with your time and the opportunities that come your way and people that are asking to work with you. And I'm very grateful for you dedicating such an enormous amount of time over the last 13 years to help so many millions of people around the world.
Thank you, Kris.
Okay, guys, let's wrap up this one. And before we go, we have 2 gifts for you, remember? One is the overall approach used in well-managed strategy studies. You can find it on firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. It is a free download. And the second one is McKinsey and BCG winning resume. It is also free download. You can find it on firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF. And what is more important, with both of those gifts, you will join our free Strategy Insights newsletter, and you will not be missing out on all the resources and ideas and approaches and thoughts and updates that we are sending out to our community. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Reach out to us if you have any questions about the program at team@firmsconsulting.com, and we look forward to connect with you all very soon.